Pokemon is now in full-blown euphoria. We're going to go over that. We're going to go over a lot more of the details from Miami Collectacon and the state of the current market. And I'll start off by talking about Pokemon and Miami, Pokemon and Collectacon, and some of the reinforcement for why I believe that we're at this kind of crucial point of euphoria in the market. And maybe actually before we even get into that, some of the discussion around what that euphoria is in terms of market cycles and how we can see that just in the price data, not necessarily from the psychology of vendors or sellers. But first of all, when we look at euphoria in a market, when we look at markets that are in that heightened market cycle, that are towards the end of market cycles, typically that's where we see some of the most aggressive price spikes. So typically when we start to see markets trend and we see markets move, the increases are relatively, not say minimal, but they're at a relatively standard level of pacing. Whereas once we start to get towards euphoria and we start to get towards kind of the end of the cycles, pricing tends to get far more aggressive. So that is actually where the majority of money is made. It's made in the end of the cycle moves, where it tends to be outsized returns. And then that's where we start to see corrections. And the Pokemon market is fully in that stage right now. We're starting to see auctions on Z and G that are pumping significantly higher than last solds. We're starting to see sales on, I'm just going to say it, shit Pokemon that no one really cares about, but in the current environment are seeing ridiculous numbers attached to them. And the whole market at the moment is just in this kind of frenzy of pricing. And again, that typically is conducive with the latter part of a market cycle, the latter stages of a bull market, and where we now would expect to see a correction coming in. And Miami, for me, was just further confirmation that this is exactly where we are. The vendors in Miami, the practices in Miami, the overconfidence in Miami at Collectacon was, to me, very, very clear. Now, I went over to Miami to be a buyer, primarily a buyer of One Piece, because the market is down and therefore it's a great opportunity for me to go and clear people out, especially at a discount. But obviously, I was also shopping on the Pokemon side of things, although I bought very little given what I'm about to discuss. But the actual kind of market dynamics at play at Collectacon were very, very interesting. And I took stock of this from two perspectives. Number one, from just subconsciously being in the environment, listening to conversations that were going on, hearing negotiation or discussions. And then secondly, obviously actively asking questions, inquiring about things, and trying to negotiate and see where people's mentality was at. And it's very clear that so many vendors are overconfident in their current stock, are future pricing current stock, are not willing to listen to current sensible offers for stock, and wholly believe that this market is now in the it's going to go up forever stage of the cycle, which again is not conducive, or is at least conducive in my belief that the end of the cycle is relatively close for us here. And when we see, let me just close this curtain off here a little bit, block this sun. When we get into this, and when we start to see this level of confidence in vendors and this terrible structure of pricing that seemed to be in effect for the majority of people. Like I said, that is really a concern from where we are psychologically. When people believe that things are going to continue always going up and that they should never sell, or they shouldn't be willing to sell for an acceptable price point now because they're concerned about 2 weeks' time, that's a danger for the market itself. That's a danger for the way that the market currently pans out, because what happens is when you start to get then a wobble in the market, people begin to panic in terms of their actions, which is where we start to see kind of undercutting take place. So we start to see that undercutting of pricing take place. People start to get nervous. They think, I should have sold. What was I thinking? And then they undercut again. And we start to see that kind of rapid decline in prices. And I want to kind of, at this point, just take a second just to say that I'm not saying that the whole market is going to crash. I don't believe that that is the case, but I do believe that there will be a correction in terms of pricing. Doesn't mean that I think everything's going to go to zero and the whole collectible space is over, but I do believe that it would be healthy for us to have a correction in pricing from where we are right now. And the mentality of what I saw from vendors was exactly that. When I was having conversations with vendors, when I was speaking to people, they were pricing 30% above market price. And a really good example of that is Chinese Mew. Like this card, um, Chinese Mew in a PSA 10. Let me get the fixed listing here. Okay, so people were selling this card at $26,000 at Miami. 26K. I spoke to two vendors. One was 26, one was 25.5. This is a 19 grand card. This is a $19,000 card. There were 3 sales yesterday around that total. That's what that card is. It is not a $25,000 card. And playing into that is purely trying to take advantage of the current environment. And I'm a vendor myself, but vendors use these like wonderful phrases to try and get you to believe that there is additional value there. So, for example, lots of vendors will say to you, "Oh, this card is very hard to get. You know, this card is something that doesn't come up for sale a lot. You may not see another one of these." And, you know, like I said, 3 sold yesterday. This is not a hard to acquire card. This is something you log onto eBay and place a bid and it's there, right? It's not a difficult card to achieve. But vendors are now using all of these phrases in terms of extracting maximum value from cards, or at least trying to set maximum value for cards. And it was very clear that that's what a number of vendors were just operating with at Miami. Like clever-ish sales tactics, you know, and somebody who has experience in the space obviously isn't going to be listening to any of that information. It was very clear that, you know, a lot of these people are just taking a chance that the buyer doesn't understand the market to the same degree, and so therefore they're trying to extract maximum value because of the current climate of Pokemon and the current emotion around Pokemon in terms of FOMO, needing to buy, wanting exposure, and some of these bigger cards representing the more interesting investor type buyers that are currently circling around. But lots of vendors were 30%, 40% over last solds in terms of what they were quoting. And on lower population cards, sure, you can make that argument that, you know, there isn't as much sales data. If something, let's say, had a last comp 6 months ago, then sure, you can look at pricing something higher because you have to pay account for the way the markets move, the fact it is a low population card and supply is going to be an issue. You actually may not see another one for sale for a significant length of time. That all makes sense. A lot of these vendors were looking at sales last week and adding 30% on top because of the current environment. And then if you were unwilling to purchase at that price, then they would tell you, "Oh, it doesn't matter anyway, because I'm happy to hold this card. I'm happy to keep this. This is fine." Like, again, classic vendor talk, which is just encouraging you to actually pull the trigger and buy, versus them actually meaningfully saying, "Yes, I want to keep this card." If you wanted to keep the card, it wouldn't be for sale. All right. It wouldn't be laid out on the stall for someone to buy if you actually wanted to keep the card. So lots of people doing this future pricing, unwilling to sell at today's levels. And that stems from an element of fear of not having exposure to the space anymore. And lots of people will feel this already. Lots of people who struggle to sell things, it's largely because they know that once that item is gone, they may not get the chance to buy it back at what they feel is a fair price again. Okay, so a lot of people struggle to lock in profit because they feel as though once that card is gone, I may not get the chance to get this back at an acceptable price point. And really, that comes down to what sort of individual are you and what sort of investor are you? Because are you somebody who's quick flipping things, in which case you're just moving on to the next thing without emotion? Are you someone that's holding things, in which case, is this the right time to sell? Are you somebody that's trying to time market cycles, and so you want to exit at the top of one market cycle and then rebuy cards on the way down? That's going to depend on you. But what I saw clearly at Miami was an overconfidence of vendors. It was an overconfidence in the stock that they had. It was an overconfidence in pricing. And it was playing into a market that obviously for the last few weeks has been fueled by the Logan Paul sale of the Pikachu. It's fueled by new participants entering the market, which again is another signal why we should be cautious around current pricing structure. And again, it was just very clear that people were trying to extract maximum value from the market when I don't think legitimately the cards are kind of there for right now in this cycle. And the other thing is when people were looking at buying, so when the vendors were turning to buyers and normal people like myself were selling to them, the quotes that they were offering for cards for buying were outrageous in comparison to them selling. Now, of course, that's always going to be the case. You expect that when you're dealing with a vendor, you might get 80% of market value for your cards if you're looking at cashing out, and fine. But the way that you work out comps and the way that you work out the pricing is very, very interesting. And it's something that as a seller, you should be very aware of. Because if you just approach vendors and you ask for what's your best on this card that I want to sell to you, then vendors are going to do some crazy stuff to basically get a better discount for themselves. And it goes completely against what they are doing when they are selling to you. Okay. So something you see at Miami, you go up with a low population card. You go up with something that is like I took a population 40 card up to someone and I said, give me a price on that. Let's see kind of where you are on this card. Now, this card has had 3 sales over the last 12 months. Okay, so 3 sales over the last 12 months. And what the vendor did is they took an average of the 3 sales over a 12-month period and they gave an 80% offer based on the average of the 3 sales. That is so far off how they would price that card themselves. Okay, if they were pricing that card themselves today in the current environment, they would take the last sold, they would be adding on top a premium because it's a lower population card and supply is, obviously relatively non-existent, and that they would be charging a significant premium over the last sold, which is also the highest sale. Yet for you, when you're offering to sell to them, they're doing some crazy math logic where they're going to give you the average of the 3 sales and give you 80% on that. So there's a lot of really poor, I would say poor vendor behavior. They know what they're doing, right? The vendors know what they're doing in that situation. They know what they're offering you. They know they're trying to get a huge discount on a card that they are literally going to sticker up at probably 2x the price they pay you. Genuinely 2x the price. And I just think that it's kind of dangerous in this environment. I think unless you're a well-informed seller or you have a huge amount of margin on the cards that you're looking at selling, you have to be very, very careful and educate yourselves on what you believe to be fair value for your card. And when you're dealing with lower population stuff, especially the stuff that's been moving more aggressively on the Pokemon side recently, you have to come armed with the knowledge and the appreciation that you have the power in that situation. Not the person looking at buying, setting the prices from whatever bullshit formula they want to try and use, because it doesn't work the same when they are selling the card to you. And I think it's really poor behavior from vendors who are operating in that fashion in this environment and taking advantage of people when they know those cards are worth significantly more. So I think that's been a really poor thing to see at Miami at Collectacon. And I hope that more people are educated to the fact that when you're selling to people, it's a far greater discussion than you're led to believe it is. And if somebody offers you on a lower population card, the average of the last 3 solds, and that's over a 12-month period, just walk straight away from them because they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. Okay, just walk away, take your card, no thank you, go see somebody else and have a proper conversation with them. So the current environment obviously lends itself to that. The current environment is supportive of that because lower population stuff has been moving very aggressively. And where we are on Pokemon right now, for me, obviously full euphoria. But it's really where do we go next from here? So does this market rotate now? Do we see a rotation from vintage back into modern? Do we start to see some modern cards start to move and start to rotate back higher? And we engage in one of kind of the classic rotations that we see within Pokemon for that to occur? Or is there a bigger problem with risk overall? So the traditional markets, stock market, not looking great still, yet to have any significant impulse. Also, geopolitical tension, thoughts of Trump striking Iran. There are a number of factors that, from a risk market perspective, combined with the fact that Pokemon is in a stage of euphoria, that don't lend themselves particularly well to prices to continue to go up at this stage at the pace that they're currently going up. And again, reiterating what I said in the middle of this video, I don't think that there's a crash incoming, but I do believe that the prices are way too elevated today and that sellers have a huge amount of psychological tells that this market has rewarded them very well, and it is highly likely that there is a correction inbound. I had multiple vendors, and again, I was buying One Piece when I was out there primarily, and I would go out to people who were selling One Piece and they wanted to get out of One Piece. They were, whether or not they were taking One Piece when One Piece was kind of having its run last month, and they took One Piece trades against Pokemon, or whether or not they just kind of dabbled in One Piece and, maybe thought they'd do something with it and now have changed their mind. But it was very clear that people were looking at moving out of One Piece, and One Piece is down 50, 60% on some cards. Some mangas are down that level, and there has been a significant correction on the One Piece side of things. And people were still willing to deal at 70 to 80% of market value. And these are the lowest prices that we've seen in the last 3 months on some of these cards. And people were still willing to discount further to get out of One Piece. Not only were they willing to do that, but they wanted to take trades against Pokemon. So I was going up to people with Pokemon. I was trading out my Pokemon at premium at the most elevated prices that we've ever seen for some of these cards. And I was using that to get up to 80% discount on some of the cards from One Piece that were trading significantly higher a month ago. And people wanted to take in Pokemon against a declining market, which is perfect. That's exactly where I want to be. If you want to pay me all-time high prices to get me out of Pokemon, and you want to sell me the stuff that's already down 50%, you want to give me another 20% discount on that just to take it off you, that's exactly where I want to be. And that also highlights that fear and greed aspect to the market. You have people hyper greedy on Pokemon, you have people super fearful on One Piece, and for me, the way that I operated, that is a perfect blend. That's exactly what I want. That's exactly the position that I want to be in. I want to be selling you Pokemon at the highs. I want to be buying One Piece at the lows. And that's a perfect scenario to be in. But like I said, to me, it highlights where we are psychologically with both of those markets. But for the purposes of the video today, more specifically with Pokemon. And I do have those concerns. I do have significant concerns about the euphoria in this market. I think the prices are accelerating way too quickly. I think that some of the vintage stuff is moving way too aggressively in the wake of the Logan Paul sale and the increased global attention on Pokemon again. I think that vendor behavior and vendor psychology is wrong. I think the behavior and the actions of some vendors is poor practice. And I also believe that for a far larger cohort of vendors, there is way too much overconfidence. There is way too much, this is going to keep going up forever at the pace it's going up. And therefore, I don't care about selling to you. I don't want to negotiate with you. I don't want to hear your offer. This is what I want. Take it or leave it. And that whole mix of factors with rising prices, overconfidence, greed in the market, and the fear of selling, okay, so the fear of actually relinquishing stock because of how aggressively the market's been moving, I think is a very bad combination, or at least a very positive combination if you're looking for a price decrease in the future. So that's where I believe that we are today. I think that the Pokemon market is firmly in that euphoria stage. I think that price corrections will be around the corner. They may not be immediate. They may not be a crash, but I do believe that the highs of what we've seen on some of these cards is now unsustainable. Demand will begin to dry up, and other risk markets are still going to cause a problem for Pokemon through here. So, or maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe I'm just wrong, and maybe Pokemon really is the up-only market forever. Again, further reiteration, I still believe that this market has an incredible future. This is just a localized short-term analysis of where I see market psychology and market pricing for right now. But time will tell. And on the One Piece side of things, I'm going to do a full video on that and kind of cover off thoughts on the One Piece side of things. And we'll go into a little bit more detail around what I saw at Miami Collectacon. But for now, the end of the Pokemon discussions, the end of the Pokemon Euphoria top calling, and I'll see you on the next one.